thanks to everybody for coming. This is work that I've done with Pam, who's here, and with Rasa Rusakaite and Alec Coley, who are from ISCAR in Victoria, Australia. The material I'm going to present today is mostly descriptive in nature, so I'm going to give you the take-home points, and then we'll proceed through the evidence, and you can decide for yourselves whether you think the evidence supports these take-home messages. So here we go. A large fraction of lost time claims are repeat claims. The second is a risk of a second claim varies by industry and occupation, but as for first claims, there's nothing special about second claims in the way they're distributed. Risk of a second claim varies little by nature of injury. A large fraction of repeat claims are with the same employer. A large fraction of repeat claims are for a different nature of injury. Risk of repeat claims depends on age and duration of previous claim. And the pattern of repeat claims in Ontario, Victoria, Australia, and Alberta are similar. Long duration claims have lower re-injury risks, and long duration claims that are followed by re-injury have lower wage replacement and medical costs. So,
just for clarification,
yes.
The one of age, is that a person's age? Are they halfway down? Repeat the risk claim?
Yes, the person's age at first injury. So, the introduction section, there are two studies very similar to the one that we've just conducted. One is in Alberta, one is in Victoria, Australia. So I'm going to quickly go over some of their key findings, and then you'll have some context to compare the Ontario findings when we get to them. So, workers' compensation claims are usually modeled as though they were independent events, and these two studies were efforts to explore the degree to which there are actually a lot of repeat claims. In Alberta, they're looking at lost time and no lost time claims, and both injury claims and disease claims. They found 54% of men filed a second claim within the 0 to 10 years of follow-up, and 38% of women. But 0 to 10 years of follow-up is a bit mysterious, so maybe a more transparent way of looking at it is if you take all the claims that happened in 95 and follow them to the end of 2004, so a 10-year incidence, then 67% of claimants in Alberta filed a second claim, which is really high. And their study included 241,000 second claims. And their understanding of these claims in their discussions with the board was that these were mostly not reopens. In Victoria, they took first claims that were lost time, and in Australia, or in the state of Victoria, the employer pays for the first 10 days of benefits. So their administrative data only includes claims greater than 10 days. So lost time claims greater than 10 days, and no lost time claims with medical benefits exceeding $500, and injury only. They found 40% of men filed a second claim within 9 to 14 years of follow-up, and 31% for women. And their study included a total of 63,000 second claims. And their understanding is that these may often be reopens.
Jason?
Yes?
To clarify, was there any limit on the duration of the Alberta claim? Could they be a single day?
I think Alberta is as Ontario, that the day of the injury is paid by the employer, and the first full missing day is compensated by the board. Does anybody know that for sure? Yeah. So risk of second claim by industry at first claim in Alberta. I'm going to show a series of graphs that all have roughly the same format. So along the bottom is number of first claims. So this is a combination of the full-time equivalents in that industry and the risk of injury by industry. So it's claims, not people who are potentially exposed. And on the right, for the Alberta slides will show a hazard ratio, and the Victoria slides will show a probability, but the graphical interpretation is the same for both. So you see manufacturing has tons of first claims, and in Alberta a slightly elevated risk of second claim. Transportation, wholesale retail, health, all fairly elevated and fairly populous, but it looks like this is the same kind of picture you would expect for first claims, and that was the interpretation of the study authors. In Victoria, again, manufacturing is enormous and reasonably elevated. Health is in here towards the upper half. Transportation and postal also elevated. I have a laser pointer. Mining in both jurisdictions it's a very small sector in terms of total number of injuries, but elevated. If you look at occupation in Alberta, an awful lot of occupations are elevated relative to managers. This is the reference category down here. But there's not that much spread, and what spread there is similar to what you would expect for first claims. This is the same thing for Victoria. This is slightly different categories, with laborers being the most common. If you're looking at the nature of the injury, as you'd expect, sprains, strains, and tears is the most common. But you notice that this is the hazard ratio relative to sprains and strains. There's very little dispersion. So fractures are a little less common. But there's really not a lot to distinguish the risk of second claim by nature of injury on the first claim. And that picture is the same in Victoria. Traumatic soft tissue is way out here. Fractures are a little lower. In both jurisdictions, burns were typical, which is a little bit different in Ontario, which we'll see in a minute. And this is the same here for accident type. A little bit lower risk of second claim if the first claim was in transportation or fire or explosion. But for the most part, there's not a lot separating these. In Alberta, they looked at age and they saw that relative to 55 to 65-year-olds, which is an unusual reference group, there is a elevated risk for people at peak career, and it's not dropping off that much for early career. We'll talk more about why that age pattern might exist when we get to the Ontario data. And this is another a different way of looking at it. Here we're talking about the first and second claims of people who have multiple claims and saying, is the characteristic of the first claim the same as the characteristic of the second claim? And we find that a different affliction or nature of injury and a different body location, that's almost half of claims. Half of claims are to a different body location and a different affliction. 3/4 of them they're in the same industry on the first claim and the second claim. Half of them are in the same occupation on the first and second claim, and almost 2/3 are still with the same employer when they file their second claim. The dates of change for employer, occupation, and industry are unknown, so you can't estimate the risk given a change. But from a prevention standpoint, we know where a lot of these people are.
Now, sometimes, if it's the same body part, it goes back to the same claim. Was that somehow factored into the analysis?
Well, in Victoria, they think that may often result in a new claim being opened. But in Ontario, the policy is that if it's clearly related to the original injury, then the original claim's benefits should be reestablished. So you'll see a period on benefits followed by a period off benefits, and then they go back on benefits again. But how that actually plays out in practice is tougher to unfold. Yeah.
Sometimes they're related body locations. So for instance, if you can't use your left arm, you might overuse your right arm.
Yes.
It's considered related. Is that part of it?
That's a fantastic question, and we're going to address it directly in a moment. It's fantastic because we're going to address it in a moment. So claim costs and duration. So this is a really interesting piece of the Victoria paper that raises a question that we think we have an answer to. So here they found, single claims are people who only had one claim during the observation period. First claims are repeat claimants, and it's their first claim. And second claims are repeat claimants, this is their second claim. So if you look at wage replacement, it's 5,000, 2,600, and then almost 5,000. So the first claim of repeat claimants has much lower wage replacement, and the same is for medical benefits. The total is very high because in Victoria they attribute legal and administrative costs to the claim. And days lost, the same pattern. So why is it that first claims are shorter and cheaper, both medically and in terms of wage replacement? So here's our study. We're looking at all lost time claims where the accident date is between the 1st of January 2000, and we took all claims from the beginning of 2000 to the end of 2009. And then we have two designs. I'm going to show you the one design first, and at the end I'll have a couple slides from the second design. We have both injury and disease. The first design is a 5-year inception cohort taking all the accident dates that are from 2000 to 2004, with a 5-year follow-up from the accident date of the first claim, looking for whether there is a second claim or not. This is similar to the Victoria study. We found 23% of men filed a second claim and 21% of women filed a second claim, for a total of 96,000 second claims. And as we were just saying before, our understanding is that these are mostly not reopenings of past claims, because the policy is that they should go back on benefits for the original injury. But there may be content experts here who disagree with whether that actually happens in practice or can confirm it. There's a mostly trivial difference between whether you measure 5 years for post-accident or post-benefits, in terms of, so that if you're on benefits, you're unlikely to have a new injury. So there's this, if you measure from the accident date, there's a period of time where you're not likely to file a second claim because you're not at work, you're on benefits. So you could either measure a 5-year follow-up from the accident date, and then you've got this period where you probably won't have a second claim, or you could measure it from the end of benefits and look forward 5 years and assume the person is exposed for that whole period of time. And that might be important from a technical point of view, but in practice, it doesn't change the picture here. So slides like the ones you saw before, manufacturing is enormous and kind of in the middle of the distribution in Ontario as opposed to elevated. Mining is low, whereas it was high or in the middle with the others. When I presented this in the US, somebody with a dark sense of humor suggested that first claims were fatal. But these are lost time claims, they're not fatalities, so that explanation actually doesn't work. For occupation, trades, transportation and equipment operators, sales and service, processing and manufacturing are the really large categories and reasonably elevated. Health is quite elevated, although a little smaller. And for both industry and occupation, we think that this pattern by the risk of second claim is the same pattern you'd see for the unconditional probability of a first claim by industry. And we'll address that a little bit more with the second design. Again, we see that there isn't that much difference by nature of injury. So musculoskeletal disease compared to wounds, compared to traumatic soft tissue, there's not a lot of difference in the probability of second claim, whether the first claim was in any of these categories. Burns, unlike the previous two jurisdictions, is a little lower, and fractures, like the previous two jurisdictions, is a fair bit lower. So here I put side by side the agreement between Ontario and Victoria. So we have a different nature of injury between the first and second claim, and a different body location, almost exactly the same in Ontario and Victoria. Half appear to be different injuries. A slightly higher fraction are with the same industry in Ontario, a slightly higher fraction are with the same occupation, and a slightly higher fraction are with the same employer. We're doing work right now to make the designs as comparable as possible, and these numbers become a lot more similar. If you change the follow-up time, so Victoria's published study is a 9 to 14 year follow-up, and we have a 5. And I'll show you why that matters. So here we have the number of days between the first accident date and the second accident date. And here we have the probability of a difference between the industry, occupation, employer, nature, or part of body of the first and second claims. So if your second claim is immediately after your first claim, your industry probably hasn't changed. 10 years later, your industry has a 40% chance of having changed. Occupation immediately, if your second claim is immediately after your first claim, your occupation has a much larger chance of having changed already, but not employer. And employer changes most as you follow up over time, whereas occupation changes the least. as you follow up over time after having a big jump at the beginning. Part of body and nature of injury have no function over time. It doesn't matter how long after your first claim, your second claim is, the chance of your part of body or nature of injury being different is the same. Does that make sense? Like, the interpretation may not immediately sink in, because I'm not certain it has for us completely. But does the nature of the graphic make sense? Good. So this gets back to Ellen's question. So there are different ways to think about whether two measures agree. So something very familiar to people who have a medical background is kappa. So this is do these two measures agree perfectly? And here you see that it's 0.11. It's with a really tight confidence interval, and that suggests that there's statistically significant agreement. But you certainly wouldn't want these to be two medical diagnostic tests for the same thing. The agreement's very imperfect. So, but there are other ways to think about whether these two things agree. The first one is independence, which is the way most people do regression modeling. You put in the characteristic of the first claim, the characteristic of the second claim, and say, are these statistically independent? If you know the margins of the two, that's all you need to predict all the possible combinations. And it's, not surprisingly, that's rejected. These are two characteristics of the same people over time. So the chance of them being statistically independent is really low. Quasi-independence is almost the same thing, but in this case, you say, yes, there's going to be perfect agreement sometimes. You're going to have a trunk injury followed by a trunk injury, or a neck injury followed by a neck injury. Let's ignore those and say, what about all the other combinations? Neck, trunk, neck. Let's say those are completely independent after we adjust for perfect agreement. And that set of assumptions doesn't explain these data either. We can reject that. So then something a little more permissive is called symmetry. And symmetry says that there'll be pairs of categories that are related. So maybe if it's the same injury, it might be called neck once and arm another time, or neck once and trunk another time, because those, they're proximate, they're etiologically perhaps similar for some kinds of injuries, but it doesn't actually matter whether it's trunk first and neck second, or neck first and trunk second. That's why it's symmetrical. And that is also rejected. But the trouble with a test of perfect symmetry is that if you have a tiny difference in the distribution of, in this case, part of body codes between the first and second injury, then it'll be rejected really, really easily. So a slightly more permissive test is quasi-symmetry, which says it doesn't matter whether it's trunk-neck or neck-trunk, but we're also going to allow the distribution of first and second claims to be a little bit different. And that test we only barely reject. So this is a huge data set. We have tons of statistical precision. And so a quasi-symmetric model says that we do not have a situation where people are injuring their leg and it's causing a consequent trunk injury because they're compensating or something. Because if that were the case, you'd see trunk or leg followed by trunk more often than you would see trunk followed by leg. Right, so that's this idea of consequent injuries. Then the part of body or the nature of the first injury is causing the second injury. And that although we reject this model, we only do so by a very little bit. And if you look at the difference between the observed and expected proportions, it's tiny. It's a couple percent either way. It's just it's nothing to write home about. So it doesn't look like there are a lot. There may be some, but there are very few injuries that appear to be consequences by part of body or nature. So I explained it for part of body. This is the same evidence for nature, and the stats are exactly the same. So everything I just discussed for part of body applies to nature equally. Does that make sense? Does anybody have a clarification question on this? So this is the mystery I suggested or described at the beginning for Victoria. We have claim costs and duration in Ontario, wage replacement over the first 5 years of the claim or over the first year of the claim, and we have single claims, so people who only file one, the first claims of people who file two, and the second claim of people who file two. and the wage replacement is 8,500, 2,600, 7,500. So the first claim group is strangely low in terms of wage replacement benefits. In terms of medical benefits, 2,100, 700, and 1,800. So same pattern. And that pattern persists even if you follow up for only 1 year. And days of benefits, as you'd expect, agrees as well. So 176, 73, and 150. So second claims and single claims are similar, but first claims are low.
What is SDD?
Oh, standard deviation. Sorry, so the mean is the average number of dollars or days, and the standard deviation is the distribution around that. So here are candidate explanations. One is an immortal time bias, and this is the idea that long duration claims have a period when they're not at risk of second injury because they're on benefits. So the expensive first claims, if they're long, don't have a chance of having a second claim because they were on benefits and therefore not at risk. And there is a bias in the way we've analyzed it because we're measuring from accident date to accident date, but the bias is very small and it doesn't change the picture at all. Another explanation is that there's labor force exit. So in this case, we've assumed that people are exposed for a second claim after they return to work. But it's possible that benefits end, they go through the return to work process, and then exit the labor force for some reason. It could be they're going back to school, it could be they're emigrating out of province, it could be that they're going into retirement or disability retirement, but they're no longer at risk of having a second claim. So we don't have good data to test that. It could be that there's a prior claim history that we haven't measured, but in Victoria they saw the same pattern and they had a measure of first claim going back to the beginning of their scheme. So it's very unlikely, we think, that that could be the explanation. But a fourth explanation, and this seems to be where things are happening, is that long duration claims have lower repeat claim risk. And so here, the cost and duration for claims less than 365 days are similar for repeat and non-repeat claimants. And then the question is, why is this? Is this labor force exit, or is it changed occupations and tasks, or some other difference? Here's the claims less than 365 days, and the mean now is 33 benefit days versus 29 or 30. So almost no difference for claims less than 1 year. For claims greater than 1 year, the benefit days is fixed because we're just looking at the first year of benefits. So of course they all have 365, but the wage replacement is 15,000 followed, or the median, 15,000 followed by 8. So this big decrease in the wage replacement and medical benefits is due to claims lasting longer than 1 year, and that effect is already strongly apparent in the first year of their benefits. So that you'll also see that, I don't know, maybe people at the back of the room can't see the very bottom of the slide, but the claims that last less than a year are twice as likely as claims that last longer than a year to have a repeat claim. So I'll show you a little bit more evidence from Ontario using a different way of putting these data together. So we extracted 10 years of lost time claims. This time we're going to use the full set as time to event data. So we have time to return to work, and then time to the next claim, with a potential for that to go in cycles. So they have the second claim, and then back to work, and then third claim, and back to work, fourth claim, back to work. So some people have 20-odd claims, but that's pretty rare. And then there's this question of an unmeasured competing risk that we just talked about. That we're assuming they're exposed for a second claim because we have no way of identifying whether they go back to school, whether they switch to homekeeping, retirement, self-employment, immigration. There are a lot of ways people could not be at risk. And this study design is similar to the Alberta study. So here is age. So these, maybe I should explain the graph first. This is a Kaplan-Meier survival plot for people who know what that means. If you don't know what that means, then this is time at the bottom. Days between the end of benefits of the first claim and the start of benefits of the second claim. So this is the full 10 years. this line is drawn at 5 years. So we've got years across the top and days across the bottom. At the beginning, this is the return to work of the first claim. So everybody hasn't had a first claim. And as you follow forward, more and more people have had a second claim. So you get to 5 years, and you read across here, and you get to 0.75, which means 25% of people in these age groups have had a second claim after 5 years. Does that make sense? And these categories that are having their second claims most quickly are 30 to 49-year-olds. The 65-year-olds, who you would expect to be retiring, look like they have fewer repeat claims. What we can't say is that because they're at lower risk and at work, or is it because they're not at risk because they're no longer at work? I think it's quite likely this is a picture of labor force exit for older people. And for younger people, these are 15 to 19-year-olds and 20 to 24-year-olds that are also showing less risk of repeat claim over time. I think it's quite likely that they're not in the same occupation they were in for the first claim, maybe a lower risk occupation, or they've gone to school and aren't at risk at all. So here is another picture of the by duration of the first claim. So at the bottom, the groups most likely to have a second claim are 0 to 90 days, are this group of lines here. And then you get to 90 to 180 days, and this line is 180 to 365, and the least likely to have a repeat injury are claims lasting longer than a year. So this is a little bit different. Everything I've shown you so far is risk of second claim having had a first claim. Here's the dose response of how many claims have you had and what's the risk of the next claim. So this is, if you've had one claim, this is your risk of a second over time. If you've had 2 claims, even more likely. And it's this very, very strong dose-response relationship. So this is, if you've had 4 claims, what's your probability of having a 5th claim? And the answer is, within 5 years, you have a 50% chance of having a 5th claim. That's a pretty high risk. And now the interpretation of this is tricky. So I'm going to try to explain it clearly. So this is the risk of a lost time claim by the industry of the previous claim and the number of previous claims. So at the bottom, we have 1 previous claim, 2 previous claims, 3 previous claims, 4 previous claims for each industry group. And on the side, we have a hazard ratio saying, is retail trade, for example, more likely to have a subsequent claim than the reference group, which is manufacturing. So we just saw here that for every repeat injury, you're more likely to have a second injury. The question here is that differential by industry? And the answer is mostly no. Right? The hazard ratio is relatively constant as you move across the number of previous claims for accommodation, for construction, for health and social service. Retail trade is sloping up a little bit, but not a lot. Transportation storage might be a different story, and wholesale trade is almost flat. So the magnitude of the hazard ratio isn't giving us information here, it's the slope. And the question is, when we looked at the risk of a second claim by industry, we said, that looks like the pattern you'd expect for first claims. But we don't have a description of the insured population, so we can't, without going and pulling in extra data, we can't compare the risk of first claim by industry to the risk of second claim by industry. What we can do, though, is compare the risk of first claim by industry to second claim by industry to third claim by industry. Sorry, I said first, but it's second, third, fourth, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 previous claims. And there's very little in it. So it does look, yes, Cam?
So just help me. In these claimant histories, what point in the history are we ascertaining the economic sector that they're in?
Yeah, so this is, good question.
Thank you.
This person, or these people who have 1 previous claim, their first claim was in accommodation and food beverage. These people who have 2 previous claims, their second claim was in accommodation for
Their
failure.
first claim.
Their first claim is somewhere.
Could have been.
Yeah, quite likely it was in food and accommodation, but it could be anywhere. And here's the same thing by occupation. So relative to sales and service, business, finance, administration, no particular slope. Health, it's elevated, but it's the same from by number of previous claims. So it doesn't look like the occupation is modifying the repeat claim experience. Yes?
I think prior claims, are they only loud claims?
Yes. So the one group that might be a little bit different is social science, education, government, service, and religion, which slopes up a little bit. But for the most part, these are quite flat. So it doesn't look like the experience or the probability of having second claims is differential by occupation or by industry. It's just the background risk associated with those injuries playing out across repeat claims. Does that make sense? So this is the same slide I showed at the beginning. There we go. Lots. A large fraction of lost time claims are repeat claims. Risk of a second claim varies by industry and occupation, but as for first claims. Risk of a second claim varies surprisingly little, I think, by nature of injury. A large fraction of repeat claims are with the same employer. A large fraction are for a different nature of injury. Risk of repeat claim depends on age and duration of previous claim, which may be more about labor force exit than about those being risk factors. The pattern of repeat claims in Ontario, Victoria, and Alberta are strikingly similar. Differently administered jurisdictions, somewhat different policies in various respects. Alberta doesn't have an obligation to re-employ, for example. The other 2 jurisdictions do. And still very similar. Long duration claims have lower re-injury risks, and long duration claims followed by re-injury have lower wage replacement and medical costs. So thanks everyone for your questions. That was really helpful. I hope it was helpful to you too.